Hello, hello. Welcome to the first episode, kinda, of Final Album February. Now, before we get into the topic this month, first we have to define what necessarily is a final album, because unlike debut albums, where most of the time there's no contention, final albums sometimes you can ask questions about that, right? Because with especially with progressive rock, there can be lineup changes, so that by the time you get to the last album, there's only one guy from the original lineup left, or maybe even nobody from the original lineup left. So it really does leave a question of, is this legitimately the last album of this name, or is it a couple albums before that? Pink Floyd, famously, there are four different albums that could lay claim to being their final album. Some would say that it's The Wall, as it's the last Pink Floyd album to contain all four members of the classic lineup, that being Roger Waters, David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright. Or you could say it's the Final Cut, because it's the last one to contain Roger Waters. Or it's the Division Bell, because it was the final album for 20 years. Or it could be The Endless River, which is the actual final album. I oftentimes consider the Division Bell to be the Floyd's final album, even though The Endless River exists, mostly because The Endless River is like 90% made up of stuff that was recorded during the Division Bell sessions. The Doors have three albums that could lay claim to being the final album. There is, of course, L.A. Woman, the last album recorded and released within Jim Morrison's lifetime. There's the second album they did without Jim Morrison, which was released in early 1972. And I forgot the title of it, and it has a very 1972 progressive rock cover. And there's the one that they did in 1978 using recordings of Jim Morrison reading some of his poetry. And I think that 1978 one really serves more as an epilogue. I need to listen to the 1972 one. I will leave you an update. I will that you might see me review that this month. And then there's bands where their final album, it's not really content. Well, actually no. One more example. Lynyrd Skynyrd released an album in 1977. Shortly after that their touring plane crashed, and many of the band members died, but the name continued on until just recently the original guitarist passed away. I don't know any of their names. I'm not that big a Skynyrd fan. I enjoy some of the music, not that big a Skynyrd fan. So is the album that they put out in 1977 the final album, or is the last album put out within that guitarist's lifetime the final album? Who's to say? And in the case of Frank Zappa, who released something like 60 albums in his lifetime, and a further 60 albums have come out since his death, do we count the final album as the last one released within his lifetime, or as the most recent one released by the Zappa estate? Or is it one that came out before the final one released it within his lifetime? Because the last album released within his lifetime, I believe, was a recording of a symphony that he wrote. And then there's bands where their final album is definite, such as Genesis with Calling All Stations. Some people would say that We Can't Dance is their final album, but it is Calling All Stations, because there's enough of the band there that where I'm like, yeah, no, this lays a legitimate claim to the Genesis name. Because they had operated as a three-piece for well over a decade at this, almost 20 years at that point. I might talk about that album this month. And then of course, there's Led Zeppelin. Their last album is Coda. There's no contention. So for the most part, final albums are an artist's final album. The final album with an artist or band's name attached to it. So that was a big roundabout discussion. It was a big roundabout way of saying is that, sometimes the definition of a final album is nebulous, but for the most part, the last album under an artist puts out under that name is the last album, or the final album. With that, I would like to thank you all very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like on it. If you have something to add, please feel free to do so in the comment section down below. If you want to continue along my musical journeys with me, please feel free to subscribe. If you want to hear me talk about something other than music, I have a podcast with two of my buddies. It's called Dorkies. I will leave a link to the most recent episode of that in the description below. And if you want to hear what I happen to be listening to on any particular day, or a 15-second segment at least, you can follow me on Instagram at Sean_Heaster1979. I post a 15-second segment of a song there on my story there every single day. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much for watching. And remember to stay weird and keep jamming. I'll see you all in the next one.